We remember the Vikings as roaring warriors, blades flashing, ships slicing through fog, and fires burning on the horizon. But the real story didn't end when the battles did, when the shields dropped and the screams faded. Something far darker began. It wasn't the warriors who suffered after the fight. Their agony ended on the battlefield. The true horror waited for the ones left alive, the wives, the daughters, the women who drew breath when the axes stopped. This is the part of Viking history no saga wants to tell. What came after the raid, and what those women endured, not in legend, but in evidence buried beneath centuries of earth and bone. The silent aftermath. The year was 845. The monastery at Clonmacnoise stood like a quiet fortress beside the River Shannon. Its monks prayed for protection. It came too late. When Ragnar's fleet struck, the assault was swift and merciless. 40 monks died defending the altar. The chronicler's hand stopped mid-sentence. The page left blank. He wrote of slaughter, not what followed. But archaeology finished the story he couldn't. At Dublin's Wood Quay, iron shackles were unearthed, narrow rings forged for women's wrists, smaller ones for children's ankles. Nearby stood stone foundations of warehouses large enough to hold hundreds. These weren't for goods. They were for people. The Vikings didn't just steal gold or relics. They stole lives. Every village they conquered became a human harvest. The captured women were catalogued like cattle, young, fertile, and profitable. The flesh market in the Norse world, silver spoke louder than blood, and a woman's body had a price. Runic inscriptions found in Schleswig described the going rates: 20 silver coins for a healthy girl, 15 for a mother, 10 for the wounded. They weren't myths, they were receipts, carved in stone. Slave markets in Viking Dublin operated like any other trade post, weighing, sorting, selling. The difference was the cargo. Every ship that docked brought new stock, wives from Ireland, daughters from Wales, even children taken from Saxon farms. The sagas called it taking spoils, but the bones tell the truth. It was systematic trafficking, not chaos, not passion. Business. When death was mercied Irish. Annals mention the raid on Port Mor in 862. They record 47 men killed, but nothing about the 53 women taken. Centuries later, a bog nearby revealed the rest. 23 female skeletons, each showing signs of prolonged violence. Broken ribs, shattered arms, crushed skulls from behind, wounds no warrior bears in battle. These were not random killings. They were executions. The soil dated the deaths to within days of the raid. It meant these women didn't die fighting. They died after surrender, after capture, after the raiders decided what to do with them. Death came slowly, deliberately, like a ritual repeated until it lost meaning. The law of ownership in the Viking world. There were laws even for cruelty. They called it kona, Ignu, own woman, a title as cold as it sounds. According to 9th century Icelandic codes, when a man killed another in battle, he could claim the dead man's wife as his property, not as a servant, as a wife by conquest. 3 witnesses were enough to make it legal. The woman's word meant nothing. Her consent wasn't required. If she resisted or ran, she was hunted. The GRG's law book even set a deadline. The claim must be made within 3 days of capture. After that, anyone could challenge ownership, leading to fights between men over women, like livestock at auction. Marriage was supposed to sanctify union. In the Viking world, it sanctified rape, the sacrifice of the living in 878. Vikings attacked the monastery at Bangor. The chronicles describe it as total destruction, but they never mention what followed the flames. Archaeologists uncovered burn layers filled with female bones, not scattered, but arranged in circles, signs of a ritual, not a massacre. When a great Viking warrior died, his most valuable possessions burned with him: horses, weapons, and women, sometimes wives. sometimes slaves. The Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan witnessed one of these funerals in 921, along the Volga River. He described a slave girl chosen for sacrifice, given wine, drugs, and the illusion of honor. She was assaulted, strangled, then burned beside her master's corpse. One account, one witness, but the archaeology repeats it across Scandinavia. Boat burials show female skeletons with strangulation marks, crushed throats, and traces of henbane, a plant that causes hallucinations and compliance. They were drugged before death, so their fear became devotion. The Vikings called it a gift to the gods. The children that weren't meant to be 900. The Great Army wintered at English records mention cattle theft and church fires. They don't mention what happened inside the camps, but the rubbish pits do. Among animal bones and pottery shards, archaeologists found tiny skulls, infants, dozens of them. Each showed blunt force trauma, deliberate, efficient. These weren't stillbirths. They were erasures. The victims were the unwanted children of Viking men and enslaved mothers. Children born of rape. Under Viking law, the child of a slave was a slave. If it couldn't work, it died. The killings weren't rage. They were policy. A grim logic: erase what shouldn't exist. The shadow network across northern Europe. Viking settlements formed a web of trafficking. Dublin, York, and Hiddeby all had ports built for trade. All shared the same architecture: wharfs, storage houses, and drainage systems. Not for rainwater, for human waste. The infrastructure wasn't temporary, it was permanent. A machine built to process flesh. Ships carried women from Ireland and Britain eastward, through rivers, across frozen seas, toward the markets of the east. Arabic accounts from Baghdad describe pale-skinned women arriving by the dozens, sold at enormous prices. To them, these captives were exotic luxuries. To the Vikings, they were currency, the evidence buried beneath that Repton, in England. Excavations uncovered 249 skeletons from the Great Army's winter. Camp 873 to 874. 63 were women, a number too small, too deliberate. The rest, missing. Isotope analysis revealed the truth. The women weren't English. They came from Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, lands the Vikings had plundered. Some died of sickness, some of childbirth. The rest disappeared into the slave routes that stretched from Dublin to Kiev. They didn't vanish. They were erased. The price of defiance. The chronicles fall silent on what happened to women who resisted. But the ground remembers. In 914, when Irish forces recaptured Dublin, they found what the Vikings left behind: execution pits beyond the city walls. Stone-lined holes, 6 feet deep, 3 wide, too small to lie down, too deep to climb out. Inside, skeletons of women, bones twisted, legs broken to prevent escape, arms shattered to stop They were buried alive, left to die over days. Some pits contained sharp stones, others held water. The suffering wasn't punishment, it was spectacle. A warning. Viking law was explicit. A slave who harmed her master faced slow burial. It wasn't metaphor, it was policy. Soil layers proved the women stayed alive for days, decomposing slowly, their deaths a form of control. The economics of pain. By 919, Norway's King Harald Fairhair had united his realm, ending Viking civil wars. But peace didn't end the trade, it perfected it. With predictable trade routes and political order, human trafficking became organized commerce. Merchants could now guarantee delivery, a grotesque reliability recorded in Byzantine treaties. The Rus-Byzantine Agreement of 944 lists prices for slaves by age and gender. Young women brought the highest rates. Pregnant women were discounted. Children had almost no value. The Vikings weren't just raiders now. They were businessmen dealing in human life. The portable pens archaeological digs at Brunanburh site of the decisive battle in 937 revealed something horrifying in the aftermath. Iron frameworks designed to assemble and disassemble quickly, sized to hold 12 adults or 20 children. Portable pens. These weren't battlefield relics. They were transport cages for captives. The Vikings could build, load, and dismantle them as they marched, a mobile slave market. Every hinge, every chain shows wherefrom use. It wasn't rare cruelty. It was routine, human industry. By the mid-900s, slave trafficking had become an industry spanning from the Irish Sea to the Caspian. Each major Viking town had its own holding chambers. Each port had its processing areas. From Dublin to York to Hiddeby, the layouts were identical. The trade was systematic, deliberate, and efficient. The Vikings didn't just conquer people. They built an economy upon them. The truth beneath the myths for centuries. The sagas told stories of glory, of ships, swords, and gods. They never spoke of the chains, but the bones, the soil, and the inscriptions do. The Viking world wasn't only built on courage and exploration. It was built on slavery, the bodies of the conquered, and the silence of their suffering. They believed they ruled by divine right, but the evidence shows an empire of pain hidden beneath the poetry of the sagas. The Vikings didn't just write history. They buried it, one body at a time. Closing line for part 1. If you value history, told through evidence, not myth, subscribe. It's the best way to support the work that brings the truth back from beneath the earth. And tell me, from which city are you hearing this story? Because next time, in part 2, we uncover what happened when the empire of raiders began to collapse, and how the Vikings turned their brutality inward upon their own. Shining sword in every longship that cut through the misty seas, there were unseen hands, shackled hands, hands that built, that burned, that bled in silence. The Viking world was built not only on conquest, but on ownership. Those taken from foreign shores didn't find themselves in chains forever. Some found worse, a life stripped of identity. In the frozen lands of the north, the air was sharp, the nights endless, and mercy was a word few had ever heard. The captured were brought to wooden halls that echoed with laughter and drunken songs. Yet in the corners of those same halls, broken souls moved like shadows. They were the invisible heartbeat of the Viking age, the enslaved. They rose before dawn, long before the chieftain stirred. The cold bit into their bones as they fetched water from ice-capped streams. The fires they lit would warm others, not themselves. They were forbidden from using fine tools or speaking unless spoken to. Even their names, the last gift of their birth, were taken. A slave from Ireland became Brynja, a name given in mockery, meaning the strong one. But her strength was never her own. The Viking household was a mirror of the sea, cruel, unpredictable, and ruled by whoever held the blade. Some thralls were treated like animals of value, worked and fed only enough to survive. Others were punished for mere glances. Their masters could do as they wished. The law belonged to them. In the sagas, the word thrall appears again and again, yet always in the background, faceless, voiceless, and that's how it was meant to be. For the Vikings, slavery wasn't shame, it was power. Owning another life meant prestige. It meant wealth, control, and legacy. But among all forms of enslavement, none was darker than that of the women. Captured women became part of their masters' households, not as guests, nor as laborers alone, but as possessions. They were used in the fields, at the fires, and often in the beds. The law did not recognize their suffering. In Norse codes like Frostathing and GRGs, a slave's violation was not called a crime, it was called a property matter. If she bore a child, that child too belonged to her master. Flesh bred for ownership. It said some masters treated their slaves with what they called kindness, letting them eat leftovers from the main table. or letting them live in the same hall instead of outside with the animals. But kindness in such a world was only another form of control. Markets for these human lives existed. Everywhere the longships landed, in places like Hidibi Riv and Burka, people were sold beside amber, iron, and furs. Chains were displayed like tools, and flesh like merchandise. Archaeologists have found iron collars, neck rings, and shackles buried under the ruins of those towns, grim proof of what trade truly meant. In one grave, a woman and a child were found linked by the ankles, a single chain binding their bones for eternity. They were not buried with honor, nor remembered in any song. To their captors, they were just inventory. Some slaves were sent far beyond the north. Viking traders, with their wide networks, sold captives to the east, into the lands of the Abbasid Caliphate and the Byzantine Empire. The fair-haired slaves fetched the highest prices, admired as exotic in foreign markets. In Baghdad, a single slave from the north could be worth more than a bag of silver. These were the same men and women who had once walked free on distant shores, now displayed as curiosities beneath foreign suns. But not all accepted their fate in silence. There were whispers of rebellion, quiet tales that spread from hall to hall. 2 slaves once killed their master and fled into the forests of Iceland. For weeks they hid in the wild, hunted like beasts. Their freedom lasted only until the next sword found them, but the legend of their defiance lived longer than their bodies. It became a forbidden story, one that even the powerful couldn't fully erase. Deep in Norwegian forests, ruins of small huts have been found, hurriedly built, abandoned in haste. Some say they were hideouts for escaped thralls, places where the enslaved dared to dream of freedom, even if for a single night. Still, most never escaped. Their resistance came in quieter forms: a broken tool, a slowed hand, a whispered curse beneath their breath. They endured because there was no choice. Even death was not always an escape. In Viking burials, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of slaves sacrificed to accompany their masters to the afterlife. At the Oseberg ship burial, a woman was laid beside her mistress, her body showing signs of violent death. She had been chosen to follow her owner beyond the grave. The Arab traveler, Ibn Fadlan, once described witnessing such a scene. A slave girl, told she would join her dead master, was made to drink, to sing, and finally, she was killed while others chanted around her. It wasn't cruelty in their eyes, it was ritual, a belief that even in death, power must be served. And yet, beneath this horror lay an order, a system so accepted that few ever questioned it. Slavery wasn't just a part of Viking life, it was the backbone of it. It built their farms, their ships, their towns. It funded their wars and filled their feasts. Without slaves, there would be no Viking age. But time is the one enemy no empire can conquer. As Christianity began to seep into the northern world, a new morality began to whisper through the frost. Priests spoke of sin, equality of souls, and the wrongness of owning another human being. Kings who converted to Christianity used freedom as a symbol of faith, freeing thralls in the name of God. Even if their hearts still beat for gold, it didn't happen overnight. Many freed slaves continued to work the same land, for the same masters, under new names: servants, workers, bonded laborers. The word thrall began to fade from law, but it lived on in speech and memory. In English, it became enthralled, to captivate, to control, a shadow of its true origin. By the 12th century, the Viking slave markets had vanished. The ships still sailed, but not for flesh. Europe had changed, and with it, the story of human ownership took new forms in other lands. But the silence of those who suffered beneath the Viking sun never truly disappeared. Their bones still lie beneath old trade towns and burial mounds, telling their story in fragments of iron and ash. They remind us that behind every myth of glory lies a truth paid in suffering. The Vikings are remembered for courage, adventure, discovery, but not for the cries that echoed beneath their songs. And maybe that's the cruelest truth of all, because history remembers the conqueror's hand, but not the chained one that built his world. Closing line YouTube style. If you value real Viking history told through bones, scars, and truth, subscribe, because stories like these deserve to be remembered. Tell me, from which city are you listening tonight?